Turn me on. Okay, it's 4:15, the last session of the day. How has your day gone? Okay, so, good. Awesome, I'm hearing some awesomes and greats. Good, cool. You guys get invited back. So,
Made it to the end of the day.
we have context is everything. So it's important to write meaningful alternative text. We have Lainie Strange from the state of Missouri. Take it away, Lainie.
Okay, can you hear me all right? I'm trying to do the center so that if I turn, they gave me a good tip on that. If I turn, you can still hear me. Thanks for sticking around. I know this is the last session of the day. And I am Lainie Strange. I work for the state of Missouri. I've been working in web accessibility for probably 15 years. I'm sure there's some of you that are working in this realm and it's something that kind of evolved. And suddenly you're like, oh, well, you know, in some cases you may end up being go-to people or champions or advocates and different things like that. And it just kind of evolved and I've really, really enjoyed working in this space. All right, so context is everything. Meaningful alternative text. And you're probably like, can you really talk 45 minutes just about alternative text? Yeah, you can. There's a lot of different things to cover. And alt text has been mentioned in a lot of the other presentations today, here and there. And I'll kind of pick up on some of those things as well and kind of take note of some of the things that were mentioned. But what we're going to cover today are the key principles of how to identify what it needs to be using both content and identifying function. And then I just kind of kind of developed a whole plethora of examples that kind of just help you figure out what those might look like in a wide variety of implementations. And we'll even cover web documents and social media, which was touched on earlier in the social media presentation. And then I'll give you 5 good key takeaways and then hopefully some Q&A time at the end. And if not, I've got contact information if you want to follow up later on. So we will start. Okay, so the first principle in the Web Accessibility Guidelines is alternative text, and it can be one of the most difficult ones to implement and to understand. And it can still involve a decent amount of interpretation. So what is the role of alternative text? One of them is primarily, you think of screen readers primarily when you think of the benefit of alternative text. It also is a big benefit for cognitive issues as well, or just keeping it simple, different implementations like that, and we'll touch on those as well. It will display in browsers if the image file is not loading, you're on your phone and you're not having a good connection, and it will preload those alt texts so you at least get an idea of what is going to display there. And finally, it provides meaning and description for search engines. Having that alt text included, I know many of you have probably done searches where you were actually, in fact, looking for an image to implement in some way with something you were doing. And having that alt text integrated into those images is what helped you find the images that you came across. So, huge benefit there as well. So what are the things that you need to think about whenever you're trying to figure out what should this alternative text be for any given image, different types of images, etc. So the first thing you want to think about is it like functional? Is it an action? Is it a button? Is it a link? Next is, does it provide content? So when you're going to be looking at a page and looking at that image and seeing the content that is around it, and many times that will help you figure out what that alt text should be. And again, we'll also be covering, there will be times where it doesn't provide any content, and we'll be discussing that as well. So I thought I would start off by taking an image, and hopefully you can kind of make out here what's on here. I'm using one image and I'm implementing it. I have 3 slides here. I'm going to implement it in 3 different ways to show you that the alt text is going to change based on the context of how it's being used. In this case, this first one, it is an image of inside of a photo gallery. A blind friend of mine, Gretchen, nicely let me use a whole bunch of her photos throughout my presentations. And this particular implementation here of this image on a web page is part of a photo gallery of her navigating around Mizzou campus with her guide dog Keeper. So in this case, we're basically just explaining what she's doing. She's traveling across campus, and in this case, you'll see here, Keeper judges the traffic to make sure that Monty can safely cross 9th Street. So in this case, that was a successful use of the alt text. Number 2, same image, but we're going to use it in a little bit different way. This is an advertisement for the Accessibility Resource Center. Now, I just kind of made this up for demonstration purposes. But in this case, we have the image, and it is actually saying that Keeper is kind of like a welcomed member to the Accessibility Resource Center, and there's a resource there. And in this case, we have a caption below that's on the page, but we're just showing Keeper at work on campus. And we keep it short. I'll talk a little bit more about if you add captions, physical captions underneath the image, that you don't want to just have your alt text repeat it and do something redundant. In this case, you'll either want to have it kind of enhance the caption, or, in some cases, you may end up having an empty alt text. But in this case, we're going to have a brief alt text in this case for this. Example number 3, same image. This time, it is an online manual for Keeper's official guide for guide dog work. And in this case, we have a section of the manual where, in this case, it is a demonstration of the basics of how a dog would lead in a support situation. So in this case, we have Keeper and his handler walking. Keeper is out in front, and his back legs are level with his handler's legs. So in this case, it's informational, and you're describing what's going on. So you can kind of see how context will drive what that alt text will be, and it could be the same photo used in different ways. So the next portion we're just going to talk about a lot of different real-world examples, and as we step through these, you may think of things that you utilize on your websites that you're using, and you may think of how you're currently doing those. So charts. Charts are somewhat complex. In this case, we have an organizational chart that's describing the hierarchy of a K-9 division organizational chart in this case. So this is complex, and we're not going to be able to fit what's going on in the alt tag itself. So in this case, what you're going to want to do is create a text format either below or linked in somewhere. And in this case, an equivalent would be possibly a hierarchy of a bulleted list. That would be a good example of this. There's other types of charts you can think of, flow charts, different things like that. I've also got some resources at the end that will help with some of these more complicated imagery. Charts. You see them in documents, we use them in websites, news releases, different things like that. They are complex And so how are we going to handle something like this? Again, an alt text that you should keep it probably around 125 characters. You may not be able to manage to explain all of it in what you're seeing visually. So I advise the clients that we work with throughout the state to create some sort of data table formatted option for your different charts that can be put down below if you're confident that it couldn't be explained in, for example, 125 characters. All right. Logos. In this example, we're talking about logos or a masthead. So Missouri State, a lot of websites use a template to manage their sites, and the header's repeated across the top, either with text and a logo, and it's a repeated part of the site, and typically it will link you back to the home page. So in this case, this implementation, we've integrated a logo for a particular site, but in context, we don't need to, make call to the logo that's in this. So in this case, we're repeating the text, and since it's a header, we're going to also put Missouri Assistive Technology Home, since the purpose of it is to typically get you back to the home page as kind of part of the overall navigation of the site. This is an example simply of a logo that may just be integrated into a page, not part of a header, and not something that you're repeating across the site. So in this example, the alt text looks a little different. In this case, we're repeating the text as part of the logo, and we are making a little bit of a nod to what's incorporated into the logo, the yin-yang logo. Now, you probably don't need to go into too great a detail. You don't need to start explaining exactly what yin-yang is and the colors and different things. You can kind of keep this high level, but yet describing that there's text and some information in that logo. Okay, we've talked a little bit in some of the other presentations. I know there's been some discussion about maps. I've got a few slides here about maps and just some tips and tricks about thinking about how to work with those and what you should be doing. Now, if you're creating a map all on your own in some sort of program that can develop, let's say a regional map that you're going to be breaking down regions for a state, things you want to think about: provide a long description in text, and then think about screen reader accessibility and keyboard accessibility, meet color contrast requirements, and just mentioning that, and then using the shading and patterning. I know in some of an earlier presentation, one of the things that really resonated with me, I think Derek mentioned it, was thinking about when you have imagery that's very visual in nature, remove it out and then think about, if I remove this, what is a way that I would represent this in another way? Kind of helps you kind of go through that flow of what you would do. So in the case of maps, you kind of have to think about what's the purpose of the map and what kind of detail do we need. A few tips on Google Maps. Give it a descriptive heading. In this case, I gave it I described the purpose of the map right above the heading in text format. And iframes give it a title property, and that's something that a lot of accessibility checkers will check for. Include a link to the non-embedded map. So in this case, I link this heading here to an actual map. And one other reason as you've heard a lot about, especially, iPhones and different things like that, that the apps end up being a lot more accessible for people that rely on that type of technology. So they may first hit a link in the browser, but if you put the link there, it'll pop them over to their mapping app, and then from there, they probably have a lot more accessibility available to them as they're navigating through that map through their native application on their phone. So you're kind of giving them those segues to get over to leveraging that accessibility that they have integrated already into their phones and computers, etc. And to continue on with maps, Esri, like the Esri and GIS maps, these kind of implementations, they get more complicated. A lot of times you really do have to kind of think about, is there some other alternative formats, such as tabular data, that I can provide them with an alternative version. I did some research on Esri in particular, and they do have a group at Esri that's been doing some accessibility work, so that's really nice to see. They had a whole GitHub site set up to help people implement complicated maps like this in a very accessible way. So that's been those are the kind of things that I like to see, where you find those champions out in these vendor tools, where they're actually trying to make their tools more accessible and easier implementations for people when it comes to more complex things such as maps. Okay, alt text. In this case, we're integrating an image, and it's also serving the purpose of a link. So we're kind of getting into function as well as content in this case. I've got a few examples here. Images that are links. So in this case, the top image I have here of Derek Featherstone is highlighted blue, giving me that visual indicator that it is a link, and it could go to example, bio information, more detailed information about the speaker. In this case, we would want an alt text for that, because there's no text-based information wrapped with that link, so we would give it an alt. In the second example I have, you'll notice that the link below it, the text below it, is also a link, and that's actually, we were to look at the source code, we have that text wrapped inside of our link tag. So the text itself on the page is providing the text alternative in this case. In that case, you could do alt equals quote quote, which is considered just an empty, and it would just, a screen reader would ignore it and continue on and just read the text Derek Featherstone, and then you could move on to the link that way. Icons. Many sites for like 508, they need to indicate that a link is something other than a web page, such as a PDF document, a Word document, etc. A lot of times you'll implement something in your styling, where it's like a background image, and then you can display it and give it alternative that way. In this example, I'm showing an actual image that's following the link, indicating it's a Word document, and the alt equals Word document. But there's a few different implementations for that, but there's an example of one thing that you could be doing. All right. Text contained inside of an image. Here's an example that I have here. This is my friend Gretchen. She actually just got a new guide dog back in November, December. Her prior one that I had in the photos was retired, went to her parents. It was just time. She'd had him for about 10 or 11 years. This is her new dog. I haven't met him yet. His name is Royal. And in this example, I have both an image that conveys information, and I have text over the image that also conveys some information. So the alt is going to reflect Royal and Gretchen saying, "Don't forget my alt text." So we're going to make a nod to both of those, both the content and the text. Okay, so the next few slides we're going to talk about decorative images, and you'll see a lot of uses of this just for design purposes, different things like that. So in this case, you see some blue buttons that have some icons in front of the text. In this case, they are treated as background images within CSS, which I'm not going to get into the technicalities of that, but they don't, for a AT user, they don't even know those images are there, and they honestly don't serve any purpose other than something visual. So in many cases, your designers and your developers are going to program icons like that to display as what we call background images, and they don't even require any alt text. Let's see, any other things I'm covering in there. Watermarks, I mentioned a little bit there too about MS Word. A lot of times people will use watermarks inside of Word documents. It's draft or different things like that. And in a document such as that, those kind of images are artifacted as part of the header. So again, they're treated for a screen reader as a decorative item and won't be read. Lines or horizontal rules. You don't see these as often as maybe you did like 20 years ago in design. You know, through headings and text spacing and styling, you're able to kind of divide up your content. But they are still used. Lines, horizontal rules, things like that, they're going to be treated as decorative. And again, those would be set with alt equals quote, quote. Signatures. Many times you may have like a welcome message or, you know, a signature inside of a Word document, etc., where it is an image of a signature. And here is an example of how you would handle that to signify what that is: signature, quote, and then in this case I have Royal. All right. Infographics. I know we were talking offline about infographics earlier. In this case, an infographic is, you know, one big image that is both text, graphics, etc. So, you know, how are you going to convey an alternative version of this? WebAIM actually has a really great example of taking that same information and conveying it in a text-based format and still kind of integrating the imagery, as you see here, with text-based links. I was just in a presentation on readability, and you know they did make mention for readability that infographics can actually be a huge help for, especially for cognitive. You have a website that has, you know, lots of text. Maybe you've got users that have a hard time taking in a lot of text, which, you know, all of us do. Simple is the best. So infographics can be very helpful for some people to kind of digest a little bit of information in an organized fashion. So there are definite benefits to infographics, but you just have to figure out, you have different audiences, you know, they're helpful for many, and at the same time you've got to create those alternative versions so that you can get public consumption by everybody. This example is probably more something that a programmer would have to deal with, and we've all seen them. We've got ratings, reviews. We all look at reviews and ratings when we're trying to figure out how to buy something. In this case, we have a rating scale of 3.5 out of 5 stars. And if we went and kind of did a quick look at the source code, we're actually applying the alt to the first image, which in this case is a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And the rest of them had empty quote, quote, alts. Just kind of an example there. This is kind of something more for, for a developer at web application side of things, but kind of gives you an example of the different kinds of things that have to be thought about when it comes to images. Okay, alt text, image buttons. So this is more of a nod to form development, but at the same time, a lot of times we have form development that does integrate images into buttons. So in this case, this is a function. What is the purpose of that image serve? And it is a search function. We would not take this image and describe what it is. We're describing the function of it. So again, this is where you're evaluating how it's being used and what you would need to do with it. So alt equals search. In HTML5, on occasion you'll see the use of figures, and you can wrap a figure with figure and Figcaption tags. And as this will identify the caption below it and connect it with the figure up above. In this case, it's not going to eliminate the need that the image would need an alt text. It will still need an alt text. You don't want to necessarily duplicate what the caption's saying. Again, you're kind of enhancing what it is there. But in this case, you will see the image will actually continue to have an alt, even though it has a Figcaption tied to it. So just if you ever think about that. Okay, now we're going to kind of move on to documents and social media as it relates to alt text. So document development, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, any others of those kind of tools. The same rules are going to apply here. The implementation is just going to be a little bit different than how it works on the web. So for example, and in my screenshot example here, this is for like Microsoft Word 2016. I don't know if any of you use like 365 and some of the newer. There is actually an alt text option with your images in that. In this one, you access it just a little bit differently. So in this, you're going to click the image in a document, and then right-click those image properties, and then you're going to select that third icon over, size and property. I know this is a big question that a lot of people have. Do I insert in the title? Do I insert in the description? Do I put something in both? The rule is to place it in the description area, and you do not need to put anything into the title area. So description is where it is in some of the older versions, and there is an actual alt text option directly in the newest versions of the Office products. And if you ever have to do any remediation of an Adobe document, kind of after the fact that's been converted, just a show of hands, how many of you do any have you ever had to do any Adobe PDF remediation? Yeah, a lot of times once you start digging into that, you're like, this is where you really the benefit of getting it right in the first place. But in many cases, you're probably remediating, in some cases, other people's documents. So, but that will happen. But you can go in through accessibility checking, as well as stepping through the document in the tag tree and getting into those images, and you can modify what that alt text looks like, as well as if you run the accessibility checker and step through your images, you can actually tag your images in there as decorative if you need to. A lot of times you will have, you may have a cover image for a guide or a manual, and that needs to be tagged as decorative. If I remember correctly, I think you may be able to tag decorative in the newest versions of Office as well. That's not something you can normally do before you get to Adobe Acrobat, but the tools are responding, and you're able, with some of those newer versions, to tag both decorative and it makes it a little bit easier to find it as well. So, nice feature here. Okay, I'm gonna run through the social media alt. If you were listening in on the keynote over lunch, they actually talked a lot about here what I'm going to show you. It is really nice over the last few years that social media has been responding, but like they said, I think it's coming from the users saying, hey, you need to update these tools to make them work and make the ability to provide alternative text. So I won't step through and explain. I know that he actually kind of stepped through and explained how to do it. But in Facebook, you can add alt text through your edit photo options. You can do it with the desktop version of Facebook, but not with, unfortunately, the mobile. Maybe one day the mobile will catch up. But you are able to override what it automatically will tag it as, which probably in most cases is not really what you need or want. But it's a step in the right direction. So Twitter also has an alternative text option. One difference with Twitter is that you actually have to enable image descriptions for, it's kind of a one-time thing with your account. You have to go in and let me look here. Under settings and privacy, you go in and you can enable image descriptions through a check. And then once you do that, you have the ability, then it will give you the ability to go in and add that alternative text. And then you will be able to add descriptions with your image and provide that information. Instagram is newer on the horizon for alt text. I had actually done this presentation last summer, and when I was reviewing my presentation to do and tweaking it and all that, I'm like, oh, Instagram has that feature now. That's great. I think it came out in about November or so of last year, that you can now add alt text to Instagram. And you are going to do that, as you add your imagery. There is an advanced settings option, and then you can go in there and write the alt text right in as you're uploading that image. And highlighting a little bit on alternative text for video content. This was mentioned before about, in some cases, you need to actually add audio descriptions into video content that go beyond just simple closed captioning. There could be things going on in the video that are not being verbally, explained that can be captioned. So you have to have someone go in and actually burn that in and integrate that into your video. I've got an example here where you have, a sun rising at the beginning of the video where, for a user, there's going to be a pause in that video, and they're going to be kind of wondering, is something going on that I don't know what's going on? It kind of provides that gap of any other content going on in the video that's not already being conveyed through audio. So in my research, obviously there's many more other social media tools other than just the ones I have here, but Flickr, photo downloading sites, they still don't really have any good ways of adding alternative text, and you're still kind of left with tagging the alt text with any other fields that you have available to you as you're uploading those files. And again, as mentioned earlier, Snapchat does not have any alt text options to date. So we just need to keep bugging them and see if they'll add those. All right. So here are kind of the overarching takeaways that I want to leave you with today. You want to be accurate and equivalent in presenting the same content and function of the image. So kind of what I was saying earlier, picture yourself taking an image that, provides content and function, and if you took it out, what would need to go into its place for someone with cognitive or is non-visual or low vision? How would they consume that same information that someone with vision, etc., would be able to? So you want to create something that's equivalent and not just something that kind of gets you halfway there. You want to be succinct. This is kind of the nod to keeping it simple, to the point, if you're going to use the alt property tag, you want to keep it, say, around 125 characters. Some of the ATs had limitations years ago on how long an alt text could be. Those have kind of changed, but at the same time, you kind of have to think, if your alt text is getting extremely long, chances are you probably need to format it in a different way other than dropping it into an alt tag, such as a data table or, the example that we had earlier with the map where an alternative version was a drop down to get to that same information in a different way. There's a lot of different ways that an alternative implementation can be a lot of different things. Not be redundant. I spoke to this a couple times during the presentation. So if an image has a caption underneath it, you don't want your alt text to just repeat the physical caption underneath it. You want it to either enhance what that caption says or think about the possibility that maybe it needs to be, in some cases, maybe it needs to be empty. But just think about not making it redundant. Think about your users not wanting to hear the same thing multiple times. One of them that I didn't mention earlier that I think is really important especially when people are first learning how to write alt text. If you have a photo, you don't want to be using photo of, image of, graphic of at the beginning. You probably see that a lot. I have that a lot, and then I kind of have to go in and educate people on that. There could be some isolated cases where you need to, like if the purpose of an image was an illustration of something, that's kind of a little different. You kind of see where I'm going with that. But image of, photo of, graphic of is just taking up unnecessary space in your alt. So you can keep that out. Another question I get a lot is, for images, do I fill in the title and the alt? Again, if you fill them both in, it's going to read, many ATs will read the title tag and the alt text tag, and if they're redundant, it's just reading it twice. So there's probably rarely, not too many cases where you're going to need to fill in a title tag. Keep it to the alt. And last but not least, I mention, I think this is really important, and I know I was talking about it earlier. A lot of times as web content publishers, you will get content passed down to you that you're checking that was not something you created. You don't necessarily know what the alt should be. Your subject matter expert needs to be writing it. I was talking to someone from the accessibility group over at Mizzou, and she was talking about having some staff adding alt text to online textbooks. Those get complex. Not everybody's going to know what this complex chart is really telling you. So those content authors are the ones that need to be writing it. And if that means kicking it back up, and again, this is education. I mean, that's kind of where it starts, is educating all your staff that are generating the content and having them write that alt text for you so that you're not just guessing what that alt text might be. So, and I know the slides are on the website. I've got some great resources here for writing alt text. One of them I've got listed here that I'll just kind of point out. W3C has a page called the alt text decision tree. It's really great. It's actually like a WYSIWYG thing where it asks you or kind of a flow chart, that's what I meant. It asks you, is it functional? And it asks you all these different questions. And it'll kind of help you figure out at least how it should be written. It may not tell you exactly how to write it, but is it content-based? Is it a link? Is it a function? And then it'll give you suggestions on how you should write that. So good resource there. The first one I had there, Social Security Administration Alt Text Guide. It's basically a huge guide of, here's just a whole bunch of examples of how to write alt text. So you may find that really helpful as well. And of course, WebAIM's got some great information as well. And I included in, maps are pretty complex. I added in here some resources for more complex maps and, online maps, flow charts, things that are a little bit more complex if you're trying to figure out how to create alternative versions for that. All right, and I've got my Twitter handle on here. So as you go back, if you start thinking of things that you're working with or things that your staff are working with, feel free to drop me a message and I can try to help you kind of figure out how to guide you on that. So does anybody have any questions about anything, any examples? Yes?
When you if you create a post on Instagram and you have it linked to your Facebook and your Twitter and you do the alt text on Instagram, does that carry to the other two?
That's going to be, okay, so if you post to Instagram and you have it automatically post to other social media tools, is that going to carry over? To my knowledge, I don't think it does. I think it's going to be something, since you did it in that source document, there's a good chance it's not going to carry over. So you'll have to go back over. That's a good test. I should try that out. In my mind, I'm thinking that won't work, that you would have to go over to the tool and actually implement that. Good question. Any other questions, comments? Hopefully you found this kind of helpful. I know it's kind of this, mysterious thing sometimes when you're trying to write alt text and kind of give you that. But really that whole, does it provide a function? Is it content inside of your, overall page? Kind of gives you the clues on how to write that text. Yes?
Yeah, so one of the clients that I work with has an e-commerce site where they have blog posts that have images that link to particular product pages. How would we handle alt text for those images to articulate that there's a link, or would that already be taken care of?
Well, okay, so he's asking if you have a blog post and you have an image, and the image is linking over to a product page. So in that case, and I don't know how automated the blog post, if you're just able to, insert in the image and you actually have the ability to modify the alt text. Do you have any idea if you have? Okay, so in that case, you've just inserted an image into a blog post that also serves as a link. In this case, it's going to a product page and you would need alt text, and that alt text would be some, abbreviated version of the product name that it's going to take you to. So it would need alt text, and that's kind of pretty much how you would do it.
So you wouldn't need any specific links to, or anything like that?
Good question. So he was asking, should there be an additional link somewhere? As long as there is both a visual cue that the image is a link. If there's not a visual clue, or, one of the examples I showed had the blue highlight around it, if it's not real clear that the image is a link, then you would want to provide an alternative link to it. Obviously, if you keyboard to it, you want it to get some sort of highlighted focus, or from a visual perspective, you need to give an indicator that that image is a link. So, good question.
Thank you, Lainie.
Anybody else?
Wonderful.
You guys made it. Thank you very much.
The feedback button and the slides button is up on the schedule. Thanks for attending 2019.